already know Kelly McLeod-Shingen. She has been a longtime member of SIETAR USA, served as past president and also the conference co-chair in Tulsa a couple of years ago. Kelly is president of KMS Intercultural Consulting, which is a global diversity and inclusiveness consulting group. He's also a mediator, a storyteller, and an actress. And this is a personal passion for her. So Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Julia. It is my pleasure to be here to talk to you guys this morning about my story with civil rights. And it's a really general experience, frankly, but I think that what's most important is just recognizing that we are all impacted by significant social events that happen around us. And in many ways, we make a choice on how we're going to act and or for or towards that particular social experience. And so what I wanted to do, excuse me, was to share with you what my personal story is around civil rights. As a storyteller who has come from a long tradition of storytellers within my family, it's really important to me that I heal myself and I come up with ideas about how it is that we can improve this social experiment called the United States of America through storytelling. And so I wanted to share that with you guys today. And as we look towards the upcoming SIETAR USA conference, it seemed irresponsible to not talk about civil rights and how some of us as interculturalists recognize that marriage between the diversity and inclusion work that we do as well as the intercultural work that we do. All right, so for some reason, oh, there we go. So who am I? Excuse me. I come from, as I said, a long line of storytellers, and I am the great-granddaughter of Chris Smith and Althea Pajati, the granddaughter of Max McLeod Sr., the daughter of Bess and Max McLeod Jr., sister of Monica McLeod, the wife of Scott Shingen, mother of Max and Catalia. And I'm a global diversity and inclusion specialist, actor, director, singer, and storyteller. I was born January 31st, 1968, what some call as the year of tragedy. 4th, 1968, Dr. King was assassinated. June 6th, 1968, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. These were major players in the civil rights of the United States, and I believe in my bones that I was inspired by these tragedies. The stories of my ancestors, the stories of my elders were impacted by what was happening at that time, and I know that I was in my mother's arms at the television when Dr. King was killed. I was also in my mother's arms when Kennedy was killed. I have no doubt that the tears from my mother's eyes fell to my face, and I was inspired by that in order to figure out the question, why? I believe that my life is driven by the why. I also want to tell you a little bit about the people who have helped to shape me. Where I'm from, who I am, is because of my family. Everything that I am has everything to do to my inclusion journey, if you will. The woman you see to the left is my Aunt Diane. Her name is Diane McLeod Peoples. My Aunt Diane was a student at Fisk University, and she was one of the first students that was a part of the Freedom Riders. Many of the stories that my Aunt Diane told me about survival, about the level of fear that she felt, but also the drive that she knew that she had to do something, even if that meant that she might die, that she had to, because she knew that someday she wanted to have children and wanted them to live in a better world than the one that she had inherited. So being part of the Freedom Riders and her telling me those stories, I would sit at the feet of my aunt and hear these stories along with the stories of my grandfather. And I would be so moved to want to do something more. My uncle to the right was one of the early members of the Black Panther Party in Chicago as well. So between my aunt and her pride of the civil rights movement and doing something and getting up, and my uncle, his Black pride, and wanting to do something for the people within the community to make sure that they were fed, that they had good health care. The stories that we hear about the Black Panther Party is the story made by the dominant culture that was afraid of an empowered and educated Black population. And so what I knew to be true was that my uncle was out tutoring kids, feeding the elderly, as well as young kids who did not have food in school or at home. And this is what I saw. And the fact that they were willing to arm themselves to make sure that we were not being over-policed and that they were not being brutalized in the community was something that I embraced as a cultural pride and a care for our people, because if no one else was going to do it, we certainly were. So I'm deeply impacted by those stories, those very personal stories of my elders having lived through the civil rights movement. So what do we know about civil rights? Well, we know that it, according to the history books, et cetera, that it began in 54 and ended in 68 abruptly at the deaths of Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy. Some of the people that you see here are the ones that we have heard stories about, right? We know that Dr. King, we've heard about his March on Washington and his great I Have a Dream speech. We often spend a lot of time talking about the brilliant Rosa Parks and her amazing contribution to the movement as well by refusing to relinquish her seat and thus propelling the movement into the bus boycott.
Kelly, just this is Julia, just interrupting. Your voice seems to be going in and out a little bit, so not sure if, just wanted to let you know that.
Okay, let me see if I can bring the volume up just a little bit more. I don't know if that'll help. Is that better?
We're sometimes losing you completely, so I don't know if others are having this or if it's just me, but just wanted to let you know.
Okay. Okay, is that a little better?
That sounds better. Yeah, I've gotten a couple messages for people saying that that it's cutting out for them as well, but it sounds good now. Thanks.
Okay, no problem. Okay, let's hope. Fingers crossed that we can keep it here. Okay, so in 1954, as I said, we know that this is the story that we've been told about when the civil rights began. And these are the people who we may have spent more time hearing about. Again, I started with Dr. King and his March on Washington and his I Have a Dream speech, probably one of his most famous speeches. We have in the upper left corner, Rosa Parks, who many say propelled the movement because of the bus boycott, because she refused to give up her seat to a white woman who, after she got home from work. And then you'll see the photograph of Thurgood Marshall, who was the preeminent lawyer of all civil rights activists, all civil rights laws that were trying to be put forward from the community for justice. Then you have Lyndon B. Johnson signing civil rights legislature. And to the right, you'll see this is many community taunters, neighborhood taunters who were taunting the Little Rock Nine. So we know that these things are a major part of the civil rights movement as we know it. These are the people who we know who might have been the ones who propelled the movement forward to help lift it up. The ones that I know that my children learned about in school, every year they came back and had a report to do on Dr. King and Rosa Parks. It was as if there were not so many thousands of millions even of other individuals that were out there doing the important work of the civil rights movement. But these are the images and these are the people who we know most about. What I'd like to share are some of those little less known civil rights activists. And again, the ones that have directly impacted me and my story around civil rights. So Claudette Colvin, who you see the young woman in the glasses, I'm not sure how many of you on the call are familiar with who Claudette Colvin is, but Claudette Colvin is really the first Rosa Parks, frankly. Claudette was a young student in school, and during the African Negro History Week, 5 months before Rosa Parks, Claudette refused to give up her seat. She was emboldened by Negro History Week. At that time, this is what Black History Month was known as. It was before it was extended to Black History Month. It was originally Negro History Week. She boarded a bus in downtown Montgomery, and she and 3 other Black students were told to give up their seats for a white woman. Colvin, she absolutely refused. She felt emboldened by all of the history lessons. And she said, my head was just too full of Black history. She said this in an interview with NPR. She said, it felt like Sojourner Truth was on one side pushing me down, and Harriet Tubman was on the other side of me pushing me down. She said, I just couldn't get up. It was also said that because she was too, quote, mouthy and, quote, too dark to be viewed with empathy for the movement, so the leadership waited for another movement, and that was Rosa Parks. The reason why I believe that I resonate or that Claudette Colvin was such a part of my civil rights movement, my history as well, is because I recall also being in school, a young Black girl growing up on the all Black South Side of Chicago in the community that I was raised in. And we were beginning to learn about some of the major figures that have contributed to US American history since the beginning of time. And I, for a moment, was so full of pride and so excited about this information that I was hearing that I just could not be kept down. What I love about the fact that this is the reason why George Washington Carver started Negro History Week, was to remind us, Black folks in particular as a people, the contributions of our community, and to allow us to be able to hold our heads up, because every other message that we received was not one of pride, and we were not able to hold our head up. So I resonate so deeply with Claudette, and also felt as if there was that fire of resistance that was embedded in me as a young person because of the messages that I received during those African American History Month or Black History Month lessons. Fannie Lou Hamer. Some of you may recognize or know the name of Fannie Lou Hamer. She exists, her image is in the upper left-hand corner there. Fannie Lou Hamer, in 1961, when she was in the hospital to have a small tumor removed, she was sterilized without her knowledge or consent. Doctors could legally do that to poor Black people then. The procedure was colloquially known as a Mississippi appendectomy. So common was this that the people would refuse to go to the hospital. I remember when I was growing up, I couldn't understand when my grandmother struggled and she did not want to go to the hospital. Whenever she was sick, whenever she was ill, she would say, I'm not going to the hospital. I may end up coming out of the hospital with one less part of my body than I went in there with. And I never understood that. And it wasn't until I got this message or learned this story of Fannie Lou Hamer that it began to make sense why my grandmother was so resistant to going to the doctor. I believe that there might be some of that truth that continues to persist in the African American community. When you think about things like the Tuskegee experiment as well, if you're familiar with the Tuskegee experiment, the government went into Tuskegee, Alabama. They wanted to do tests on people who were struggling with syphilis. And They told the people if they would participate in this experiment, they would be the first ones to have access to the medicines in order to cure it. Well, what was happening was that long after there was an opportunity to cure syphilis, the government continued to, with the medical community, continued to do these experiments upon Black people who had syphilis, and even infected many with syphilis as well, just to see what it would do on the human body. So again, it doesn't surprise me that there are so many people within the African American community that are fearful of going to the doctor. Fannie Lou Hamer was one when I began to realize, after she told her story about this Mississippi appendectomy, that it began to all make sense to me. In '62, after she learned that she had the right to vote, she went to try and register along with a small group of neighbors. After being made to jump through hoops, they were turned away, and on the way home, the group's bus was pulled over by police for being the, quote, wrong color. The passengers were terrified until Hamer began to sing. She sang hymns like This Little Light of Mine and other civil rights songs, and she made her fellow activists begin to feel better. Perhaps what she's most popular for is her national reputation as she co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964. This challenged the local Democratic Party's efforts to block Black participation. This was at the height of voters' suppression. Hamer and other MFDP, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, members went to the Democratic National Convention that year, arguing to be recognized as the official delegation. When Hamer spoke before the Credentials Committee calling for mandatory integrated state delegations, President Lyndon Johnson had a televised press conference, so she would not get any television airtime. He interrupted her speech with something that would not have typically required a national interruption of television to airtime. But her speech, with its poignant descriptions of racial prejudice in the South, was televised later. And by 1968, Hamer's vision for racial parity in delegations had become a reality, and Hamer was a member of Mississippi's first integrated delegation. Her story is also connected to mine because as an actor, I had the wonderful opportunity of portraying Miss Hamer as well as Coretta Scott King in a production called All the Way. It was probably the first time that I had an opportunity to really do some investigation into a character. I knew very well about Coretta Scott King. Her, I heard of constantly as I was growing up alongside the stories of Dr. King, but I hadn't heard about Fannie Lou Hamer. So this was an opportunity for me to do some research as an actor. And when I uncovered her story, I realized it also had a deep impact on me as well. Mamie Mobley, you'll see her image on the upper right-hand side of this page. Her story is one of triumph in the face of tragedy. She never sought to be an activist. That was not her journey. Her brave resolve inspired the civil rights movement and broke the emotional chains of Jim Crow. That's what Jesse Jackson would say upon her death. Mom Mobley was thrust into the nationwide psyche because on August 28, 1955, Mobley's 14-year-old son, Emmett Till, was brutally murdered in Money, Mississippi, by two white men who claimed that Till had, quote, woof whistled at one of their wives. When Till's mutilated corpse was found 3 days later in the Tallahatchie River, Mississippi officials tried to dispose of the body quickly, but Mobley obtained a court order to have her only child's remains returned to Chicago. Though his casket arrived padlocked and sealed with the state seal of Mississippi, Mobley insisted that her son's brutalized body be displayed during his funeral. "I want the world to see what they did to my boy," the grieving mother said. Jesse Jackson later said, "Miss Mobley did a profound strategic thing. More than 100,000 people saw his body lying in that casket. At the time, the largest single civil rights demonstration in American history." Until her death in 2003, at the age of 81, Mobley advocated for underprivileged children and against racial injustice. Although she never got justice for her son, his murders were acquitted by an all-white male jury. Mobley didn't let it dampen her spirit. As she told a reporter then, "I have not spent 1 minute hating." She even was once recorded to say that if the children of her son's murderers needed a home, she would welcome them and care for them as if they were her own. Maybe Mobley's stories was a part of my story as well, because my mother grew up with Emmett Till in Chicago. My mother knew who Emmett Till was. His death impacted my mother greatly, so much so that when I was a young girl and I would travel at night and drive anywhere in the city or outside of the city, if I did not stay in regular contact with my mother, and that was before cell phones, so I had to find pay phones. But if I did not stay in regular contact with her and let her know where I was, when I would be back, and then check in with her, then even to this day, frankly, and I'm 51 now, my mother is still haunted by the images that she saw of his body and the fear that she has of me and now my son and her and my nephew not coming home. These stories are a part of my stories because they in fact impacted my family in a way that has impacted the way that they communicate with me and treat me. Diane Nash. She's the picture in the lower right-hand side. She was a freedom rider and nonviolent student activist. She's a native of Chicago. Diane Nash hadn't experienced the shock of segregation within the Jim Crow South until she attended Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, this is also where my story intersects with Diane Nash. At the time that Diane Nash was a student at Fisk, so was my Aunt Diane. They knew one another because they both grew up in Chicago, and then they also went to Fisk at the same time. So when Diane became a major activist within the Freedom Rider organization or the Freedom Rider group, my Aunt Diane, being a friend, also was impacted by her friend and the injustices that were being carried out in the United States around African American people. It was the young people who were a major part of the civil rights movement. That's where the majority of the energy came from and gave the groundswell to the work of the civil rights movement. So the whites-only signs scattered throughout Nashville inspired Nash to become the chairperson of the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, SNCC, it was also called, in 1960, where she helped to organize sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. And Nash kept the group's commitment to nonviolence front and center at the sit-ins, which proved very effective in ending the discriminatory practices within the restaurants. Nash took over the responsibility for the Freedom Rides, a protest against segregated bus terminals that took place on Greyhound buses from Washington, D.C. to Virginia. Again, this is where my Aunt Diane also participated. So the Freedom Rides, which were initially organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, they encountered a mob of angry segregationists as they entered Anniston, Alabama, and were brutally beaten and unable to finish the route. SNCC, under the direction of Nash, continued the protests from Birmingham, Alabama to Jackson, Mississippi. These are the stories that I grew up with my Aunt Diane at Thanksgiving, at Christmas, at gatherings for St. Patrick's Day, because I'm from Chicago, and that was a very big celebration in Chicago that even we celebrated. It wasn't until many, many years later that I discovered that I too have Irish ancestry, 20% Irish ancestry at that. But that's not the story that I'm telling today. We'll talk about that at another time. So it's important for us to know that these civil rights activists, these are little known civil rights activists that also had a major impact on my personal story around civil rights. And I believe is what lit the fire in my belly to ask the questions why and to want to go out in search of the answers to that question, and then ultimately to become a consultant in diversity and inclusion and secure my master's in cross-cultural studies many years later and become an interculturalist. I self-identify as a global diversity and inclusion facilitator because I believe that the work that I have done around diversity and inclusion and cross-cultural awareness and communications have now seamlessly merged into one practice because I am heavily influenced by both. So with that, I want to talk about the global impact and the global inspiration. And this is the people who were inspired by the civil rights movement, as well as what inspired the individuals within the civil rights movement. So I want to begin with Mahatma Gandhi. The leaders of the civil rights movement believed if Gandhi could use nonviolent resistance to challenge British colonialism in India, perhaps it could be used to challenge white supremacy in the United States. Dr. King publicly shared his admiration of Gandhi and how he read many of his writings. Mahatma Gandhi published an article titled British and American Nazism. In a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt shortly after the United States entered the war, Gandhi wrote, "Dear friend, I venture to think that the Allied declaration that the Allies are fighting to make the world safe for freedom of the individual and for democracy sounds hollow, so long as India, and for that matter, Africa, are exploited by Great Britain and America. By Great Britain, and America has the Negro problem in her own home." He told a reporter that the Allies have no moral cause for which they are fighting, so long as they are carrying this double sin on their shoulders, the sin of India's subjugation and the subjugation of Negroes and African races. Gandhi's words echoed the feelings of hundreds of millions of colonized people and of a rising number of African Americans, which I have no doubt is how Dr. King was inspired by him. Mandela, Nelson Mandela. In 1966, Dr. King applied for a visa to visit South Africa. After accepting several invitations to speak to university students and to religious groups, unfortunately, the apartheid government refused to give him one. In December 1965, King delivered a speech in New York in which he denounced the white rulers of South Africa as spectacular savages and brutes, and called on the US and Europe to boycott the nation, a tactic the West eventually embraced and that helped to end the white rule. Dr. King was quoted as saying in South Africa today, "All opposition to white supremacy is condemned as communism, and in its name, due process is destroyed. A medieval segregation is organized with 20th century efficiency and drive. A sophisticated form of slavery is imposed by a minority upon a majority, which is kept in grinding poverty. The dignity of human personality is defiled, and world opinion is arrogantly defied." Mandela traveled to the United States after he was released from prison, and he spoke at Yankee Stadium, telling the crowd that an unbreakable umbilical cord connected Black South Africans and Black Americans. There was a kinship between the two. Mandela wrote in his autobiography, inspired by such great Americans as W.E.B. Du Bois and Dr. King. And in 1990, while after visiting the US upon his release from prison after 27 years in the apartheid era, he addressed a joint session of the US Congress where he quoted America's top civil rights leader, and he said, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last." The Irish Republican Army. Within Northern Ireland, they set up a march from Belfast to Derry that was specifically modeled after the Selma to Montgomery March. They called themselves the Negroes of Northern Ireland, and they routinely sang, "We shall overcome," at their marches. What was really impressive to me as I visited Ireland several years ago and visited the wall between the Berlin Wall, not the Berlin Wall, but as I visited the wall that separates Northern Ireland, I was moved by how many images all over the walls, all of the murals that paid homage to the civil rights activists within the United States. People like Angela Davis, people like Rosa Parks, Malcolm X. It was surprising to me. I didn't realize the influence of the civil rights movement in the Irish community until not in the level, to the level of which it inspired the movement, until I was there and had several conversations with people. Surprising and yet not surprising. So this global inspiration from the African American experience was something that Catholic Irish truly connected and resonated with, particularly because they felt like they were being marginalized and oppressed by the dominant culture at that time. Something that still persists to this very day. So the Nazis, or also the SS. A Nazi soldier was quoted in the newspaper, "In America, Negroes are killed by mobs without fear of punishment and for the most trivial reason. The treatment of Negroes in America is far worse than that accorded Jews by the Nazis, and America's criticism should be turned in that direction rather than toward Germany. As we do not bother you about executions of Negroes, you should not bother us." Images of Claude Neal's mutilized body hanging from a tree were printed in German newspapers after the lynching, as was the fact that the US Congress refused to pass anti-lynching legislation, the fact that proved that lynchings in America were not just the acts of murderous villains, but were supported by the state itself. And finally, Russia. Charles Steele, former president of the SCLC, stated, "When I was in Russia, the former Soviet Union president Mikhail Gorbachev told me it was Dr. King's philosophy that inspired him to tear down the wall in Berlin. It wasn't former US President Ronald Reagan. It was Dr. King who inspired him to dismantle communism." Charles Steele said, "It doesn't get any bigger than that." It was important for me to want to share the global inspiration because I think that it's easy to get caught up in thinking that civil rights is something that is only impacted in the United States. And as interculturalists, why do we have to talk about civil rights when most interculturalists may feel as if they are more global minded and are more familiar with and equipped to be able to talk about cross-cultural conflict as it exists between the US person and someone from France, or a US person and someone from Italy. But cross-cultural conflict also exists right here in the United States, and we can utilize those same skills that we utilize as interculturalists within our domestic walls. So, diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice versus interculturalism. Is it different or the same? Or is it different and the same? I would argue that it's different and the same. That there are some things about diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice that is not necessarily the same as interculturalism. But I think that there are skills and tools that overlap, understanding and awareness, and frankly, at the core of it, concern for humanity and the oneness of that humanity that is the same. So what do interculturalists do well? I believe that interculturalists are brilliant when it comes to understanding how we can have cultural relativity, because cultures simply do things differently, and to aspire to learn what values, beliefs, and practices that are manifested through those cultural differences, right? What I believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners do well is that we pay attention to the power structures that exist that continue to inhibit people's inability to have access to opportunity. I believe strongly that these things exist in all cultures. Sometimes we don't always pay attention to it as interculturalists, right? So I believe that if we can blend both and, we can be better practitioners. What diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners can gain from the interculturalists is that cultural relativity, right? Is that people aren't always doing things to oppress others. However, we can pay attention to the values and beliefs that drive those behaviors. And when we begin to understand them, then we can have a better idea on how to begin to dismantle the systems that oppress. These are the things that I believe that we can learn from one another. And I truly believe that we can begin to kind of sink our teeth into this as we enter into the conversations that we will be exploring at the Atlanta conference coming up. So I want to talk to you about why I believe that approaching this conversation of civil rights and approaching this conversation of what my story is, because I believe that story is a gift. It costs nothing, but it absolutely means everything, not just to the teller, but also to the listener. I want to tell you, or I'd like to read to you this poem, I think. You and I, we met as strangers, each carrying a mystery within us. I cannot say who you are. I may never know you completely, but I trust that you are a person in your own right, possessed of a beauty and value that are the earth's richest treasures. So I make this promise to you. I will impose no identities upon you, but will invite you to become yourself without shame or fear. I will hold open a space for you in the world and allow you your right to fill it with authentic vocation and purpose. For as long as your search takes, you have my loyalty. One of my favorite quotes comes from the Global Oneness Project. And they say, how am I to be in order for you to be free? As we think about what the civil rights are, basic rights to human access, right? How do I have to be in order for you to be free? I believe that if we approach listening to people's stories with that level of passion, I truly believe that we can begin to dismantle those barriers that exist between us, between the different cultures. We know that storytelling is an ancient practice. It builds community. It is to educate. It creates a way of communicating what's important, the values, the beliefs of a culture, what we should be fearful of, and frankly, just to share a generational memory. Many of our traditional cultures are oral traditional cultures, and the process of storytelling was the way that we communicated what was important to our culture and our community, what kept us safe, what educated us. Not much has changed. We have just forgotten how to tell stories in order to connect with one another. The stories of the civil rights movement, as I was growing up, made the difference in the world to me. And I believe firmly are the same stories that I tell my children. My son is one of the greatest activists. He's 19 years old now in college, and an incredible activist, social justice-minded child who selected a performing arts school simply because of the fact that social justice was a part of their vision and mission. He could have gone to several different institutions, but chose that one because of that mission. It was so important to him because of that. I have no doubt that the stories that I shared and that my elders shared are in the fiber and the bones of my child. We are sharing that generational memory that's going on to the next. So what are the benefits of that story? What's the benefits of that? Well, to the child, the benefits are healing. They create connection, community. To the listener, courage as well. To the listener, it's knowledge, also healing, also community, and develops a level of trust. So when we talk about what we can learn as interculturalists about the civil rights movement and the impact that the movement has had on individuals as well as the society, and what we've now learned globally, is that we have to get the stories. Much of what I have experienced around the world about the injustices that exist domestically, because the intercultural work that I do is around dismantling the oppression that exists domestically in other cultures and communities. And what I've learned in all of those communities, whether I have been in Finland or Italy or Estonia or Africa or Chile, is that everywhere people simply want to tell their stories, the impact of injustice on their lives. And so if we can be better listeners, we can do our part in order to dismantle these systems. So I want to introduce something called story listening. It's about moving from active listening to transformative listening. And I know how to spell transformative, but I think what's important is the trans part of listening, right? When we begin to truly transport ourselves and go to another place, when we hear somebody's story, we begin to develop empathy and compassion, which allows us to take on someone else's story and become advocates. So I want to share with you what the story listening trance is all about. This comes from Forming Tales, how stories change people. So when we're talking about a story listening trance, we're talking about being lost in a story. In that moment, when you're listening to somebody's story, when people tell you about their experience, oftentimes we experience realism, since the environment of characters are real and alive. This is where my drama experience comes in as well, because we begin to realize that as I listen to somebody's story, I am transported into it. I begin to care about the characters that I'm being told the story of. That's why oftentimes when we're talking about different cultures, different experiences, it becomes really personal when we can put a name and a face to that difference.
Kelly, sorry for interrupting. This is Julia. You're cutting in and out quite a bit again, so I'm not sure if you can regulate your mic at all, but we're missing a lot of words there.
Shoot. Yeah, so I don't know if it's my mic or if it's my internet service. See if I can get even closer to the modem to see if that'll. So the other point of this is experiencing a lack of awareness or surroundings or a process. Sometimes when we get lost in a story, right, we forget where it is that we are, and we are then transformed to the place that the story takes place. So we put in that experience. This, again, gives us greater empathy and compassion. We begin to engage receptive channels like visual and emotional. You can recall, if we're listening to someone tell a story and that person's eyes begin to well up, well. The next one is losing control of the experience, or someone or something else, right? We can lose control. We don't have any control of where it is that we're going, what we're feeling, and what's happening, because we are lost in the story of that. Again, we experience placeness, the sense that listener goes somewhere into space, right? So when we are listening to somebody's experience and they're telling us what has happened, we oftentimes will go to that place with them. And then we experience time distortion, right? The subjective time moves at a different speed than objective or clock time. So if something happened a long time ago, as we listen to a story, it often becomes present. So when people say, well, that happened a long time ago, why can't you let it go? Well, oftentimes these stories are told and retold. They become present and current. And the situations are not different from what they were then, particularly. One of my favorite quotes from TED is this notion of the shortest distance between two strangers is a story. I believe that the fact that in my lifetime, as I said, I was born in 1968. In my lifetime, I died when people will say that the civil rights movement ended. Really only just transformed into a different way of being. Activism took on a different look, a different shape, but it still was pushing forward this notion of we all have access, we all need access to civil rights. For the African American community, the civil rights movement changed, the Black Power movement, it changed into, for many years, um, a more silent movement, but yet still pushing forward. And most recently in the 2000s into the Black Lives Matter movement. So when people say that the civil rights movement happened and legislation was signed and suddenly everything was perfect, clearly it wasn't, or there was no need for many movements to continue and for us to continue to have the conversations about remembering that we still matter. We still matter, and that there's still injustices happening. As interculturalists, I think that what's important for us is to realize, what stories do we need to listen to? Because there are some stories that we will give permission to, and others that we won't give permission to. And again, as interculturalists, we have our favorite cultures that we work with, that we may have lived amongst, the languages that we may speak. So we have a certain level of affinity for those. But what's important is that because we are equipped with very specific skills, then we might want to take a bigger picture and ask, where else can my skills be utilized, right? And how can I, in the communities and cultures that I work with, be sure that I am paying attention to the stories of those who don't have access? I think that we are uniquely equipped to be able to do that. This is one of my favorite images, the elephant, and it should be a mouse, but that's a big rat, right? but the parable of the elephant and the mouse is that in every culture, in every village, in every community that exists on this earth, that there are elephants and there are mice. And this is in reference to power structures, that there are those who people believe hold power, and there are those who believe that they don't. And there is a fear between the two. The story of the fear between the elephant and the mouse is that the elephant is, with its size and stature, is afraid of the mouse. Why would it be afraid of a mouse? It's so large, it could crush the mice at any step. But the mice, from the fear of the elephant, has the ability to run up its trunk and suffocate it because of its size. So it fears the mouse. The mouse, on the other hand, fears the elephant just simply because of the elephant's size. So while the elephant needs to know exactly where the mice is so that it can make sure to keep the mouse at a distance, what does the mice need to know about, or what do the mice need to know about the elephant? Well, almost everything, because any move that the elephant makes could potentially harm the mouse. So how do we work together in order to make sure that we are including both stories of the elephant and the mouse? In the United States, African American people would believe that they are the mice in this power structure. From the perspective of the power structure of the police against the African American community, right? The police may be fearful of the African Americans because of the unpredictability of their behavior, in the same way the elephant is fearful of the mouse. Our stories, our need to be able to come to a room and talk to one another between the difference between the powers that we hold and when we are often the marginalized people, and recognizing that at any given moment, we can be both and. Until we begin to have those conversations and to listen to the stories of the other, we will not begin to understand how it is that we can work together to dismantle the systems that are harmful to our brothers and sisters. So if we do not intentionally include, we will inevitably exclude. So one of my favorite last things is, this is Tyrion Lannister. If you're a Game of Thrones fans, then you will know exactly who this young man is. But in the very final stage, the final episode of the show, he said, what unites people? Is it armies, gold, flags? He shook his head and he said, no, it's stories. There's nothing in the world more powerful than a good story. Nothing can stop it. No enemy can defeat it. I truly believe that when we slow it down, give access to people being able to tell their stories, to be willing to listen, and to recognize that when people say the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Movement, that happened a long time ago, it has no impact on us today. I am 51 years old. It still has an impact on me. I was born in '68, the year that they say that civil rights ended. The stories of my ancestors, the stories of my elders, the stories that I learned about the civil rights movement, those activists who were instrumental in making a change in this country, those all impact me now. As I begin to tell stories of my work, of my experience to my own children and to anyone who will listen, it connects me with my ancestors and then into the next generation. If we are willing to listen, nothing can stop it and no enemy can defeat it. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. Is there anybody who has any questions?
Whoever's speaking, we can't hear you, so you might, sounds like there's a lot of echo coming from your phone. You might want to just write it in the chat box.
Is there someone speaking? I'm unable to hear them.
Yeah, whoever has their phone unmuted, if you could remute it and then just type in the chat box, because there's a lot of background noise. Would really appreciate it. Thank you.
No questions?
We'll give it a couple more minutes.
I'll ask one.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, Kelly. Thank you so much. Great story. So well told. I got to go back and do my work and prepare my Lord. And because that's one of my questions. My name's Cassie, and in Massachusetts. I come from Canada. You know, like there's something. I know something about. I don't know. Your story, and I've heard Black stories over the years. I understand and relate. And there's a certain unity to it that people can kind of understand and say, okay, yes, I understand the cause. Yes, it's clear. Sometimes in some of the white stories, they're so mixed up because all different, maybe it's because we live in America more, with all the different cultures. And so they happen like in mental institutions, they happen on the street, they happen in wealthy families, they happen in different cultures. So I'm just curious that telling different stories from different places, to me it's not as clear. So I'm inspired. I want to go out and stand up, you know, right now after just even rehearing the story. I'm not sure that always happens. I don't know, maybe do you think it always happens with other people's stories too? There's a question.
So I'm sorry, you kind of went in and out. So the final question was, does it happen when you listen to other stories again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I wonder if there's as much unity. I'm used to, I know, just a lot of diversiveness, perhaps, even around multiple white stories.
Sure.
And so you just, you know, people end up not feeling so unified. This is injustice. This is oppression. This is such and such, or arguing all right through the story. And it's hard. I'm just saying that on behalf of partly many white people who want to stand up and stand beside and help and stuff, but in fact live in a fragmented world without the same type of unity, apparent unity at least.
Sure. I think that it sometimes is in the communication of that story, in the spirit of connection. Oftentimes, if someone is sharing their story that is incredibly painful. So let's say, for example, I'm listening to a young woman from Rwanda speak of her story of resolution, of survival from the genocide. And then I say, I totally understand that because, being African American, that was my exact experience, right? In my desire to connect with the pain, I may have diminished the magnitude of the experience because it's the different and the same thing, right? So it's sometimes people get hurt by false equivalencies in the story in a desire to connect. So I think that sometimes it's the way that we state our desire to connect with that story, right? That some people will either push back or feel excluded or whatever. But there's research that proves when I am telling my story from the heart, that what is happening in my body is a linking of my heart rate and your heart rate, right? So we truly are connecting, and we are beginning to be in sync. Where the way that our hearts begin to beat become in sync with one another. If that's happening physically and in our bodies without our control, sometimes our ability to be able to communicate how it is that we are experiencing that is what will either connect or disconnect us. And so it comes from a desire to be able to lead with saying, in this moment, I am connecting with you because of my personal experience. I know it's not exactly the same, but I am feeling something that is conjuring up a similar emotion. And so I thank you for telling that, because I am being awakened in that moment. Versus saying, oh, I experienced the same thing, right? So as you can see in this image or this picture of me, my hair is natural here. In an earlier picture, my hair was straightened. So in this picture, oftentimes I will make a comment about how, in some of the work that I do, about how Black hair is politicized and how people are curious about it, want to touch it and think, what political statement am I making by wearing my hair natural when it's just easier for me, right? And then if a woman in the audience says, oh, I have the exact same experience, my hair is red, so people want to touch it, it's not the same. Right? So I experience the fact that, I'm appreciative that this person has a desire to connect and wants to say, here's how I can also identify with that statement, but the extent or the depth of which Black hair is politicized is not the same as a young person who has red hair. Does that make sense? And so
yes, it does.
It could potentially create conflict versus connection. So I hear that, and I think that it just becomes important for us as we choose to connect with other people's stories, is to say that I realize that this is not exactly the same, but this is how I can filter through my story in order to make sense of your story, right? And if we can just simply make that statement, then it's easier for people who feel like they've just spilled their guts to connect with someone who might have said something that doesn't feel as if it has the same weight or depth to it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Kelly, we have a couple of other questions that have come in the chat box. Larry Baker asked, how does a listener gain trust from the teller of the story?
I love that. I love that. I think that the trust comes when the listener is truly in that spirit of active listening, where they're not waiting for a moment to interject and say, oh yeah, I had an experience just like that with my uncle, or but truly giving over to the teller and allowing them to simply tell their story and to receive it in a way that they're not trying to pick it apart, dismantle it, tell them that they're crazy, but simply saying, thank you for sharing and recognizing the gift in that story. Thank you for telling me something, taking the risk to tell that story to me. I am going to hold it in confidence and I'm going to cherish this, right? So it's the receipt of the gift. And when you begin to do that and do that with authenticity, that I am truly here, willing to listen to your story. I'm truly here, wanting to hear your story so that I can be an advocate or an ally. Then I believe that the trust begins to develop. But if it's one where the teller can feel it. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Kelly. We also have a question.
The teller is what?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
So you said the teller is what? The last word I didn't hear. Never mind.
Gosh, now that I've said it, I don't know what I said.
Never mind. The key word. Okay, my life is ruined. I missed it. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry. Hopefully I'll think of it.
That's okay.
Kelly, we have another question from Neil Willett, who says, I'm new to the field and I'm very familiar with the rural South. But what do you recommend as a beginning step for someone entering the field?
In the rural South, where's the person from originally? If they're new to the South, are they new to the States or are they just from the North? What, from the West, from the East? Because all of those will probably impact what they need to know.
Looks like Mississippi, he just wrote.
Okay, great. So I would say that one of the first things is to go in without judgment and listen. Listen to the stories of both of all of the perspectives of the experience of Mississippi, right? And be open to who the people are versus our judgment of it. And I'll give a perfect example. When I was moving from Minneapolis to Texas, Houston, Texas, and this was in 97, my life had been all lived in the North. And so the stories that we are told in the North is that the South is backwards. My mom grew up in Arkansas. She said, I will never go back to the South. It's racist. It's, I've had some terrible experiences. And she had an uncle who was lynched in Arkansas. And so the stories that I heard about the South were all very, very, very negative. And so here I am, African-American woman married to a white male, and we were moving to Texas, and I was scared beyond belief because of all the messages and the stories that I heard. So I went to Texas with my guard up. I went to Texas feeling like I would not be able to trust anybody or be able to be my full self, and was constantly watching for things that people may say that I felt was racist. And so I went without giving Houston, and specifically, not all of Texas, but not giving Houston a chance for the first 3 years. And my experience, as I began to experience Houston and slowly start letting my guard down, I really realized that it wasn't the story that I had been given, and that I wasn't allowing people or Houston to show me a different story than one that I was told or given or had made up in my own head about what it was. And so I think that my recommendation would be to allow for people to tell you what the area is in conversation, in your experiences, and be open to discovering a different story than the one that we have been told.
Thank you, Kelly. Any final questions? Okay. Oh, somebody else want to say something? We can't hear you if you're trying to talk. There's just a lot of buzzing noise. Okay. Kelly, thank you so much. This has been really interesting. Thank you for opening yourself to share your own personal story and your family's history and story and what's inspired you to do this work that you're doing today. Really appreciate your time and your dedication to SIETAR. Thank you for all of you for attending. Hope it's also been helpful and look forward to meeting some of you in Atlanta next month, where we'll be continuing dialogues on this and on other topics of interest to the field. And also, just a reminder, we do hold these webinars monthly. Our next one will be taking place on October 15th. It will be Neil Goodman, who some of you may know, will be presenting on an important topic as well that kind of ties in with what Kelly's talking about, but on unconscious bias. So stay tuned. We'll be sending information out about that very soon. Any final words, Kelly, from you?
I want to thank everyone for taking the time to come to hear the story today. And I do hope that everyone takes advantage and checks out the conference in Atlanta. And I hope to see you all there.
Okay, thanks again, everyone. And thank you to, especially to you, Kelly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Bye now.
Bye-bye.